Have you ever wondered why some people destroy their own lives chasing substances, habits, or behaviors they know are killing them? Why would a human being knowingly walk toward something that steals their health, their relationships, their dignity, and still feel powerless to stop? Is it weakness? Is it lack of discipline? Or is there something far deeper? Something hidden in the silent corners of the human psyche? Because if we look closely, truly closely, addiction begins to tell a very different story. What if addiction is not the problem? What if addiction is actually an attempt to solve a problem? Think about that for a moment. When a person reaches for alcohol, drugs, gambling, endless scrolling, food, or any compulsive behavior, what are they really reaching for? They are not reaching for destruction. They are reaching for relief. Relief from anxiety, relief from emptiness, relief from a pain that often has no language. And that pain very often begins long before the addiction itself. It begins in childhood, in the quiet moments when a child feels unseen, when love feels conditional, when safety becomes uncertain, when emotional wounds form in a nervous system that is still learning what the world is supposed to feel like. The developing brain does something remarkable in these environments. It adapts. If a child grows up surrounded by stress, neglect, fear, or emotional disconnection, the brain wires itself not for joy, but for survival. Stress hormones flood the body. The nervous system learns to stay on high alert. The brain begins searching desperately for anything that can bring even a moment of relief. And years later, when substances or addictive behaviors appear, the brain recognizes something powerful. A temporary escape, a moment of silence inside the storm, a chemical substitute for the safety, connection, and emotional regulation that was missing in the early years. This is why addiction cannot be understood by simply asking one question. Most societies ask, why the addiction? But the real question is far more important. The real question is, what pain is the addiction relieving? Because every addiction, without exception, begins as an attempt to escape suffering, not to create suffering, to escape it. And when we begin to understand this, something profound happens. Judgment begins to dissolve. Shame begins to lose its grip. And we start seeing addicted individuals, not as broken people, but as wounded human beings whose nervous systems have been trying to survive in the only ways they knew how. Addiction is not the disease of weak people. It is the coping strategy of deeply hurt people. People whose early experiences shaped the architecture of their brains. People whose emotional pain never had a safe place to be seen. And so the pain went underground, buried in the body, buried in the subconscious, until something came along that could numb it. Something that could quiet the mind for just a few hours. Something that could create the illusion of peace. But illusions never last. The relief fades, the pain returns, and the cycle repeats again, and again, and again, until the addiction itself becomes another source of suffering. But here is the deeper truth that most people never hear. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Connection to ourselves. Connection to others. Connection to the emotions we were once forced to suppress. Because healing addiction is not about fighting a substance. It is about understanding the wounds that made the substance necessary in the first place. It is about compassion replacing shame, awareness replacing judgment, and courage replacing denial. Because the moment a person begins to understand their pain, truly understand it, something powerful begins to happen. The addiction loses its mystery. The shame begins to loosen. And for the first time, healing becomes possible, not through punishment, not through blame, but through truth. And the truth is this: behind almost every addiction, there is a story of trauma waiting to be heard. When we talk about addiction, society almost always begins with accusation. Why are they doing this to themselves? Why don't they just stop? Why would someone destroy their own life for a substance, a behavior, a momentary escape? But those questions, as common as they are, point in the wrong direction. They look at the surface while ignoring the storm beneath the water, because addiction is rarely about pleasure. It is about pain. Imagine a child growing up in an environment where emotional safety is uncertain. Perhaps the parents are overwhelmed, depressed, angry, or absent. Perhaps the child is criticized more than they are understood. Perhaps their feelings are ignored, dismissed, or punished. The child learns something very early in life. My feelings are too much. My pain has no place here. So the child does what the human brain is wired to do in order to survive. It adapts. The emotions don't disappear. The fear, the loneliness, the shame, the anxiety, they all remain inside the nervous system. But the child learns to disconnect from them because feeling them fully would be unbearable without support. This is not weakness. This is intelligence. The brain is protecting itself. But here is where the story takes a powerful turn. Years later, that same child becomes an adult. On the outside, they may appear functional. They go to work. They maintain relationships. They smile when necessary, but inside something still aches, a quiet emptiness, a constant tension, a feeling of restlessness that cannot be easily explained. Have you ever felt that? That subtle discomfort that follows you even on good days? That strange sense that something inside you is unsettled, but you cannot quite name it. Now imagine that one day this person encounters something that changes their internal state almost instantly. Alcohol, drugs, compulsive behaviors. For the first time in their life, the noise inside their mind becomes quiet. The anxiety softens. The emotional pain fades into the background. The body relaxes. For a moment, they feel something they have rarely felt before, relief. And that moment is incredibly powerful. Because the brain remembers relief. The brain says, this works. Not because it wants destruction, but because it wants peace. Addiction at its core is not about chasing pleasure. It is about escaping suffering. When someone uses a substance or engages in a compulsive behavior, they are not asking, how can I ruin my life today? They are asking a very different question. How can I survive this feeling? Think about how often people misunderstand this. They see the addiction and they judge the person. But what they fail to see is the emotional wound existed long before the addiction appeared. No one wakes up at 12 years old and dreams of becoming addicted, but many children grow up feeling unseen, unheard, unprotected, emotionally abandoned. And when the human nervous system carries that kind of pain for years without healing, it begins searching for anything that can soothe it, anything that can numb it, anything that can quiet the storm inside. Addiction becomes a form of emotional anesthesia. It temporarily removes the pain that the person never learned how to process. But here is the tragic paradox. The very thing that relieves the pain also deepens it. The substance works at first. The behavior works at first. But over time, the brain adapts again. Tolerance builds. Shame grows. Relationships break. Health declines. And now the person is trapped in a cycle where the only tool they have to escape suffering is also the source of new suffering. But the deeper tragedy is how society responds. Instead of asking, what happened to you? We ask, what's wrong with you? Instead of offering understanding, we offer judgment. Instead of compassion, we offer shame. And shame is the very emotion that fuels addiction. Because when people feel ashamed of their pain, they hide it. When they hide it, it grows stronger. And the addiction becomes even more necessary. This is why addiction cannot be solved through punishment or moral lectures. You cannot shame a person into healing. You cannot threaten someone into emotional safety. Healing begins when the underlying pain is finally acknowledged. When someone is able to say, often for the first time in their life, yes, that hurt me. Yes, I was scared. Yes, I felt alone. And instead of being dismissed, judged, or silenced, they are met with something profoundly powerful. Understanding. Because the moment a person understands that their addiction was not a sign of weakness, but an attempt to cope with unbearable pain, something begins to shift inside them. The shame starts loosening its grip. The self-hatred begins to soften. And for the first time, they can begin to see themselves not as a broken person, but as a human being whose nervous system has been trying to survive overwhelming emotional wounds. And once we begin to see addiction through this lens, we are forced to confront a deeper and more uncomfortable truth about the human brain itself, about how early experiences shape the very architecture of our nervous system and quietly influence the behaviors we struggle with years later. Because long before addiction appears in someone's life, The brain has already been learning something critical about how the world works and how pain must be managed. Because the human brain is not simply born, it is shaped. It is shaped by experience. It is shaped by environment. And most profoundly, it is shaped by the emotional atmosphere a child grows up in. When a child enters the world, their brain is unfinished. The circuits that regulate stress, emotion, connection, and self-control are still under construction. And the architects of this construction are not textbooks or schools or motivational speeches. The architects are the child's earliest relationships, the tone of a parent's voice, the presence or absence of comfort, the safety of being held when fear appears, the feeling that someone sees you, hears you, understands you. These experiences are not just memories, they are biological instructions. Every interaction tells the developing brain something about the world. Is the world safe or dangerous? Are my emotions acceptable or overwhelming? When I am in pain, will someone help me regulate it, or must I face it alone? Now imagine a child who grows up in chronic stress. Maybe the household is filled with conflict. Maybe love is inconsistent. Maybe caregivers are struggling with their own trauma, their own depression, their own addiction. The child's nervous system begins adapting to this environment because the brain has only one priority during development: survival. So the stress system becomes highly active. The body releases cortisol and adrenaline more frequently. The nervous system learns to stay alert, scanning the environment for threats. The brain wires itself for vigilance, for protection, for emotional self-defense. But here is where something crucial happens. When stress becomes constant during childhood, the brain begins to sacrifice certain abilities in order to maintain survival. The regions responsible for calm regulation may become weaker. The circuits responsible for impulse control may struggle to develop fully, and the reward system, the part of the brain that responds to pleasure and relief, becomes extremely sensitive. Why? Because in a stressful world, relief becomes incredibly valuable. The brain learns to crave anything that can quickly reduce distress. Anything that can temporarily quiet the nervous system. Anything that can bring a brief sense of safety. Now fast forward 20 years. The child is now an adult walking through a world that demands focus, patience, discipline, emotional stability. But their brain has been trained differently. Their nervous system is easily triggered. Their stress response activates quickly. Their internal sense of calm feels fragile. And when relief appears in the form of a substance, a behavior, or an external escape, the brain reacts with extraordinary intensity, because for that brain, relief is not a luxury. It is survival. This is why addiction vulnerability is not randomly distributed among people. It follows patterns. Individuals who experienced early emotional neglect, chronic stress, or trauma have nervous systems that were forced to adapt under pressure. Their brains became experts at coping with pain. But not always in healthy ways. Think about this carefully. A child who grows up in safety learns how to regulate emotions with the help of caregivers. When they feel overwhelmed, someone comforts them. When they feel scared, someone protects them. Through thousands of these interactions, the brain learns something powerful. I can handle difficult emotions. I am not alone with my pain. My nervous system can return to calm. But when those interactions are missing, the brain learns something very different. I must manage my pain by myself. My emotions are too intense. The only way to survive this feeling is to escape it. And so when addictive substances or behaviors appear later in life, they plug directly into a nervous system that has been searching for relief for years. The brain experiences a powerful chemical shift. Dopamine surges. Stress temporarily disappears. The body relaxes in a way it rarely has before. For someone with a highly stressed nervous system, that relief feels almost miraculous. And the brain remembers it. The brain begins to prioritize it. Because from the brain's perspective, it has finally found something that works. But the tragedy is that this solution is temporary. The nervous system becomes dependent on the substance or behavior. Tolerance increases. The brain demands more. And slowly, the same mechanism that once provided relief begins tightening its grip. Yet the individual is often blamed for this cycle. People say, "Why don't they just stop?" But that question ignores something fundamental about how the brain works. You cannot simply willpower your way out of a nervous system that has been shaped by years of stress and emotional deprivation. This is not just about choices. It is about biology. It is about neural pathways built over decades. It is about survival strategies that once protected a child but now trap the adult. And when we understand this, we begin to see addiction through a completely different lens. Not as a failure of character, but as the predictable result of a brain that adapted to overwhelming circumstances. A brain that did exactly what it was designed to do: protect the person from unbearable emotional pain. But once we recognize how deeply trauma reshapes the brain, we are faced with an even more important question that determines whether healing is possible. Because if addiction grows from wounded nervous systems and unresolved trauma, then the path out of addiction cannot simply involve removing the substance. It must involve something far deeper, something far more human, something that challenges the way society has treated addiction for generations. And that brings us to the most transformative realization of all. And this realization changes everything. If addiction is rooted in trauma, if it grows out of pain, emotional disconnection, and nervous systems shaped by early suffering, then the question we must ask is not how to punish addiction. The real question is how to heal the pain that made the addiction necessary. But here is where society often makes its greatest mistake. For decades, addiction has been treated as a moral failure. People are shamed, blamed, rejected, and labeled as weak, irresponsible, or broken. They are told to just stop, to get control, to have discipline. And when they fail, as many do, the shame becomes even deeper. But shame does not heal trauma. Shame actually strengthens it. Think about what shame does to the human nervous system. When someone feels ashamed, their body tightens, their mind closes, their sense of worth collapses. They feel isolated, exposed, and deeply unsafe. And what does an unsafe nervous system do? It looks for escape. It looks for relief. It looks for the very behaviors we call addiction. So when society responds to addiction with shame, it is unknowingly feeding the very cycle it wants to destroy. Now imagine something different. Imagine someone who has lived for years believing they are broken, believing they are weak, believing they are beyond repair. And one day, instead of judgment, they encounter something they have rarely experienced before. Understanding. Someone looks at them and asks a radically different question. Not, "What is wrong with you?" but, "What happened to you?" Those 4 words can change a human life. Because the moment a person feels truly seen in their pain, something inside them begins to soften. The defenses they have built over years begin to lower. The nervous system that has lived in survival mode starts to feel a glimpse of safety. And safety is where healing begins. Healing addiction is not about fighting a substance with brute force. It is about helping the nervous system rediscover safety without the substance. It is about helping people reconnect with emotions they were forced to bury. It is about helping them understand the story of their pain, rather than running from it. This is not easy work, because trauma does something powerful to the human psyche. It teaches people to avoid their pain at all costs. It convinces them that if they truly face what happened to them, the emotions will overwhelm them completely. So for many people struggling with addiction, the substance is not just a habit. It is protection. It is armor. It is the one thing that has reliably numbed unbearable feelings. Removing that armor without addressing the pain underneath can feel terrifying. But healing begins when people slowly discover that they are stronger than the pain they once feared. That their emotions, however intense, are survivable. That the loneliness they carried as children does not have to define their adult lives. And this discovery rarely happens in isolation. Because the opposite of addiction is not simply sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Connection with other human beings who listen without judgment. Connection with therapists, mentors, or communities that create emotional safety. Connection with one's own inner world. The thoughts, memories, and emotions that were once too frightening to face. When people feel truly connected, the nervous system changes. Stress levels decrease. Emotional regulation improves. The brain begins forming new neural pathways, and slowly, the desperate need for external escape begins to weaken. Think about how powerful that transformation is. A person who once believed their addiction defined them begins to see their story differently. They begin to understand that their addiction was not proof of weakness. It was evidence of pain, pain that was never properly held, pain that was never given a safe place to heal. And when that understanding emerges, something extraordinary begins to happen. Self-hatred begins to fade, compassion for oneself begins to grow, and that compassion becomes one of the most powerful forces in recovery. Because people do not heal through self-punishment. They heal through self-understanding. They heal through courage. They heal through the slow and often difficult process of reclaiming the parts of themselves that trauma once silenced. And as that process unfolds, a deeper truth begins to emerge about human resilience, a truth that many people struggling with addiction have never been told, that the very sensitivity, emotional depth, and psychological vulnerability that once made them susceptible to trauma may also hold the key to their greatest strength, their greatest empathy, and their greatest capacity to transform pain into wisdom.